I came down with a bit of a man cold Tuesday night to Wednesday, so I'm actually not feeling that well. So if I suddenly start kind of blabbering on incomprehensibly even more than I usually do, just bear with me. I'll probably circle back eventually. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Pick up where we left off. All right. Hey, Frankie, I can see you for once. All right. Hold on 1 second. Get this up. You guys see my slides? Just give me a thumbs up if you do. Thank you. All right. Yeah, nope, too far. Get back to, we had just talked. All right. So we've done talking about cost benefit analysis. And I want to hit this point one more time. I'm not going to actually ask you to do this calculation. What I want you to know is that that governments and insurance companies around the world use this sort of technology, this approach to determine if they're going to pay for or reimburse care. So if you don't get a high enough benefit cost ratio, then an insurance company, or if you're in Great Britain, the British government will just say, hey, we're not going to cover that particular treatment. So we'll talk about some of those treatments here in a minute. So rationing is what we're talking about. So when a government or when a insurance company says, you can't have something, we're rationing. We're saying the reason we're not letting you have this thing is because it's too expensive and it would take away from someone else. So we have a commitment, so if you're the British government, for example, in the National Health Service, they're using taxpayer money to pay for healthcare for everybody. And so they've got a limited pie of money, and they're dividing it out. And so they use a process of non-price-based rationing that basically says, I'm going to give this to this person, this to this person, and they do it based on based on something other than price, because it's a government program. In the United States, broadly, so there's a couple of different ways that things are rationed, right? In the United States, and actually in most things outside of healthcare, things are, including in Great Britain, most things are rationed on a price basis. So we use price-based rationing, which means if you've got a lot of money, you can get whatever you want. So Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos can pretty much get whatever they want because they have the ability to pay. So rich get whatever they want, and the poor people, which is the rest of us, right? Relatively speaking, we're all poor relative to Jeff Bezos. The rest of us have to kind of make choices. We've got this limited amount of money, and we can pay for the rent, we can pay for our car, we can pay for our college tuition, right? We can pay to go have some beers over at Scorps, or we can pay for healthcare. And we have to usually we have some limited amount of money that we have to make a choice between things. And so price-based rationing, basically what we do is we look at the price of something and we say whether that thing is worth the cost or not, right? So we're doing our own benefit cost measure in our own heads, saying, yeah, that thing is worth, sacrificing the other things that I might have bought, So yes, I've got a broken leg. I'm willing to sacrifice, going on spring break so that I can have a doctor set my broken leg, and hopefully I can walk again. So you have price-based rationing, and then basically all other kinds of rationing are non-price-based rationing. So it's either price-based or it's not price-based. And you can have some blending, and some kind of here and there. But basically this is non-price-based rationing is some sort of political process. So the government decides, Great Britain decides who qualifies as a citizen and therefore a beneficiary of the National Health Service. Right. So I don't actually know the rules, but let's assume that, if you or I, who are assuming you and I, well, I'm not, I'm assuming you are not British citizens, go to London and get hurt. I'm kind of assuming that they probably will charge us for the care they provide, but that may not be the case. They may be just that generous. But this becomes really important because when someone doesn't have to pay anything, right? When the price is zero, we tend to overuse the resource. And we'll talk about this later, but that's called moral hazard. So when something is free, when a resource is provided to us without any cost, we tend to be like, hey, I will take all of that until I am completely sated. So imagine going, you've probably gone to like an all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet, and you probably say like, hey, I paid $10. I'm going to get at least $10 worth of food out of this thing. And you probably eat until you're like ready to burst. So that's kind of, at least maybe you don't, but I do. So the challenge here is, if we've made a commitment that everybody gets to come to the buffet for free, how do we keep them from eating all of the really expensive stuff, right? And so that's the idea behind price-based rationing. And so how do we ration that? Well, one is, we say, hey, you know what? We're only going to provide this many MRIs, this year. So we're going to limit the number of MRIs, and then you're going to have to get in a queue and wait for an MRI. So it might take you, instead of being able to get an MRI tomorrow, like you probably can in most US cities, you might have to wait. You might have to get in a queue and wait 6 weeks or 3 months to get an MRI. At which point you might just say, you know what, 3 months later, they call you and say, hey, we're ready for you to get your MRI. And you're like, yeah, my knee doesn't hurt anymore. Never mind. Which frankly happens more often than not. Because in particular in the US, we're too ready to use tools like MRIs. So waiting periods is one way to ration. Just say, hey, get in line with everybody else. You can't pay to go to the front of the line, which is what you can do in the United States for most healthcares. If you've got enough money, you can pay to get whatever you want. Supply side controls also include things like stringent approval of technologies. Again, going back to that benefit cost ratio calculation. And then there are others that are more complex, and including the quality calculation we're not going to get into because it involves some math. It's not super complicated, but it's beyond the scope of this class. So an insurance company or a government that provides healthcare might just say, this treatment, this technology does not meet our benefit cost ratio based on what our health economists say. And so therefore we're just not going to include it in our plan. And then some other examples include limited formularies. So a lot of drug companies will make very minor changes to their drugs so that they can keep their patent. We'll talk about patents here in a minute. So they can keep their patent going and extend the life of the patent. And a lot of insurance companies then say, the change you made is so minor and the price you're charging is so significant that you've reduced the benefit cost ratio to a point where we won't cover that variation on the drug. And so, for example, the military has a formulary is the drugs that a pharmacy or a pharmacy benefit covers. So in the military health system, which again is a lot like the British health system or the national health system of Great Britain, pharmacy leaders will work with our physician teams and say, hey, does this drug really provide the benefits necessary to justify the additional cost? And if they decide that it doesn't, they just eliminate it from the formulary altogether. And it's not something, when the doctor goes into the health record to write a prescription, that expensive drug isn't one of the things that he or she can choose. And so that provides a limit. Now, in the military health system, if you want an off-formulary drug, the doctor then has to provide a justification for why, and then that gets reviewed by a committee, and on and on. And so it's a pain in the butt. And so unless the doctor has to really believe that getting this off-formulary drug is important in order to shepherd it through that process. So that's another way, right? So the military health system is not a price-based system. It is a non-price-based system. And so these are other kinds of controls, right? So waiting periods, limitations on what kind of benefits are actually covered are forms of non-price-based rationing. Whereas under price-based, you say, well, that's fine. You want that fancy drug that is only just a tiny bit better. That's fine. It'll cost you $5,000. And if you've got the $5,000, you can have it. Otherwise, you get the cheaper version, right? One of the things that I personally saw in the military system, and one of the reasons why I don't like I don't like non-price-based rationing, is I saw very much being in the system how people of greater political influence and power got better treatment under this system of non-price-based rationing than people who didn't. So, for example, Walter Reed Medical Center is the premier military medical center. It used to be Walter Reed Army Medical Center. It's now been combined with the Navy, and so they just call it the Walter Reed Medical Center, Military Medical Center. It's down in Washington, D.C. You may have heard of it. It's quite famous, and they do some amazing. I mean, they do incredible research there. They do some, really, it's a really remarkable place. And if a president, for example, gets sick, they send them to Walter Reed because it's literally just outside of now it's in Bethesda, Maryland. So it's just outside of DC. At Walter Reed, they have a whole separate ward for general officers. So if you're a general or the spouse of a general, you don't get sent to the same room or set of rooms as everybody else does that's a beneficiary. So all the privates and all the sergeants and all the captains, everybody else goes to kind of this these generic wards, which are excellent, right? Like Walter Reed is a great place to get care. Totally. If you go to get sick and somebody sent you to Walter Reed, you should be like, thank God I got sent to Walter Reed. It's a great place. But you're not going to be on the executive medicine floor, which is they call it. I think they call it. So if you are an admiral or a general or a senior political official, you get sent to the executive medicine and you get special treatment and special attention, and probably easier access to non-formulary things and all kinds of stuff. So the risk of moving away from price-based to political rationing is, the powerful. So instead of it being allocated based on price, it's based on power, right? So it just kind of depends on healthcare is going to be rationed in one way or another because it's a resource that everybody wants. And so it just kind of depends on your worldview as to which one you prefer to have. All right. So in line with discussions of rationing, in the United States, we're not a straightforward capitalist market-based economy. Most of healthcare is quite heavily regulated. There's a lot of government interference in healthcare. One example of rationing in the United States is this thing called a certificate of need law, or a con law. And these con laws were created by the National Health Planning and Resource Development Act of 1974. And the reason they came about was because we're only 10 years into Medicare and Medicaid, and we're already realizing, holy cow, this thing that we said we wanted to give people is really expensive. And so the government had been paying to build hospitals, and then they were finding, oh, wow, we're sending all these people are spending a lot of money on healthcare. And it's not just Medicare and Medicaid, but just generally speaking, we were realizing the government, and we'll talk more about inpatient care in a later chapter, but the government funded, it subsidized the building of hospitals across the country. And you know what? When a hospital gets built, people use it. And so not only was Medicare and Medicaid already kind of getting out of control just 10 years into their lives, but all these additional healthcare resources that the government had built, suddenly realizing, wow, they're really expensive. And so they passed these rules, this law in 1974 that established that every state had to have some sort of certificate of need process. So what does this mean? Well, if you want to build a hospital in Durham, for example, if New Hampshire had a con law, which they did until about 2015, actually. So they sunsetted it, meaning it had an expiration date. The con law had an expiration date in 2015, and if it would have had to have been extended by the New Hampshire legislature, which it was not, and good for them. But if you had wanted, let's say I wanted to build, I decided, you know what, I think the people of Durham need a hospital. I think I could make a profit by building a hospital in Durham. I couldn't just, if there was a con law in place, I couldn't just do it. I would have to put together my plan, do a bunch of obviously I would have done a bunch of research before I made such a huge investment to build a hospital, but I would have to get all this research together showing that there was a need in the community for an additional hospital, because we've already got one in Dover, we've got one in Portsmouth, we've got one in Rochester, we've got one in Exeter, right? And so I would have had to prove, the existing 4 hospitals that are within a 20 to 30 minute drive of us aren't enough. There's a need. I think there's a need to have another hospital. So I would have to go to the con board to make that argument. Now, we talked last time, and so the con board would then have to say, yes, we agree with you that there is in fact a need for a 5th hospital in the Seacoast, and you can now go ahead and build your hospital. Now, I pose to you, based on our discussion of bootleggers and Baptists, right? Who do you think might show up at a con board hearing, right, to express their opinions about whether there should be another hospital built in Durham? I'll give you a hint. It'd probably be the CEO of Exeter, the CEO of Portsmouth, the CEO of Frisbee, which is the one in Rochester, the CEO of, what did I miss? Exeter, and Wentworth Douglas, right? They'd all show up and they'd say, you know what? Sounds like a great idea, but we've got it. We've got it. There's really no need for an additional hospital. That's just a bunch of unnecessary competition. It's, they'll use the popular phrase is wasteful competition. So they will say, we're doing just fine. We don't really need another hospital. That'll just be a waste of resources. And so they will make that argument. And then it would be, now we're in a political process where politically appointed people are sitting on the con board and they're making a decision about that. Now, you've got your bootleggers and your Baptists. So you're going to have, you're inevitably going to have some people that genuinely believe that there's no need for an additional hospital. And then you're going to have your bootleggers, and that would be all the CEOs, just in case you weren't following, right? Who don't want any more competition. And so they will, come out and say, there's clearly no need for that. And so con boards, depending on what they believed, spent a lot of time blocking additional organizations coming in. There are a lot of innovations that also happen. So, for example, urgent cares are great innovation, right? I don't know how many of you have used an urgent care. I have. So urgent care is sort of in between, right? It's still kind of primary care. It's in between, like your primary care, who maybe you can't get in to see, and an emergency room where if you've got like a bad sore throat or something like that, you don't really want to go to the emergency room and wait for 6 hours while they take care of somebody that just had a car accident, right? And you do, but let's say it's 7 o'clock at night and your primary care doesn't open until the next morning. Let's say it's not you. Let's say it's your 2-year-old baby that is, spiking a fever of 105, which, happens. My wife and I have we've got 3 kids, and we actually did wind up taking our first daughter, who was like 6 months old, spiked a fever of like 105. We took her to the ED. We wound up taking her to the ED. And, they basically were like, and we were young. We were like 25 years old. And we were far from home. We didn't have any family members we could call. We were living in Colorado at the time. And the ED's like, yeah, just give you some Motrin and send you home, and that should be fine. And sure enough, it was. Like all she needed was some ibuprofen, and that knocked the fever back down to in the low hundreds, like 100 rather than 105. Scary to us because we were first time first time parents, and the insurance company denied our claim, said you did not need to go to the ED with your kid because it wasn't actually an emergency. And then the ED was going to charge us like $300 for the visit. And I was able to ultimately convince, we went to see our pediatrician afterwards, and he was able to do something to get it approved, such that it got paid, and we didn't wind up having to pay for it. And he was basically like, you were just a couple of nervous Nellies, and I understand, but don't do it again. What we would have done had they existed at the time was we would have taken our daughter to an urgent care instead, because we wound up waiting like 3 hours in the ED, right? We would have taken our daughter to an urgent care because urgent cares tend to have longer hours, and they handle minor stuff like, bumps and bruises and fevers and sore throats. So that's an innovation that, would have had to been approved by the con board. Maybe they would have approved it. Maybe, one of the hospitals would have come in and said, we can handle that in our ED. There's no reason for that. No reason to approve that. So I'm not a fan of con boards. I think we should let, organizations build what they want to build and fail if there really isn't need for it. And more importantly, they should come in and push out old, inefficient organizations. So the mandate lasted about from 1974 to 1987, where the federal government was saying you have to, in order to get federal funding, you have to have a con board. And gradually, most states started phasing them out or reducing their scope. So most states still have some sort of con law. New Hampshire does not, and Vermont has a completely bonkers con board called the Green Mountain Care Board, which I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but I mean, wow, they really go into my colleagues that I talk to who run healthcare organizations in Vermont have to do a lot of groveling to the Green Mountain Care Board if they want to do any sort of change, add a service, take away a service, increase a price, anything. They have to go and beg permission from the Green Mountain Care Board. And I don't think there's any evidence that shows that it works particularly well. I can tell you that the people that actually provide the healthcare do not like the system. So con laws, you'll hear about them. As you go along. All right, so medical devices. So now we're going to shift gears. We're going to actually start talking about different kinds of technology. So we're going to talk about equipment. We'll talk about pharmaceuticals, and we'll talk about some IT stuff. So let's talk equipment. Broadly speaking, what are we talking about? Is anything that a provider uses to deliver care. And this is, so that's everything from MRI scanners to, complex stuff like MRI and CT scanners to simple stuff like blood pressure cuffs, and otoscopes that are, look in your ear. So broadly, it's anything they're using. And so, and equipment can be both a complement or a substitute. Sometimes it kind of functions as, a progression of substitute and then a complement. Specialists really rely heavily on medical equipment, and in that shape, they're complements. So, for example, a radiologist. What is a radiologist without an X-ray machine or an MRI or an ultrasound or something that allows them to get an image? Well, that's basically what they do, right, for a living. Is they use images to to see inside. They use imaging technology to see inside your body without opening you up. And if you don't have an MRI or you don't have an X-ray, what's a radiologist good for? Not much. I'm sure they're excellent conversationalists, but that's about all they can do. So a radiologist is a great example of a near perfect complement. So last time we were talking about like left shoes and right shoes, right? Like, I don't really want a right shoe without a left shoe. I don't really want a left shoe without a right shoe. I don't really want a radiologist without some imaging technology. They're pretty much useless. And then I can't do anything with an MRI if I don't have a radiologist to read it. So they are, in a sense, perfect complements. It's a pretty good example of perfect complements. Now, surgeons, right, use all sorts of technology as well. Like, nobody wants to have surgery without anesthesia. That's a pretty perfect complement. But a surgeon can work without it, just can't work very well. But they also have some amazing, they have tons of technology that helps them perform their surgeries better. One of the most recent ones is robotic surgery. And it's been interesting because I've talked to surgeons who were in the field pre-robotic surgery, before robotic surgery became a standard, and then talking to younger surgeons who come up through their training and get trained and do their training with robotic surgery. And the surgeons that there is evidence, it's well established, that robotic surgery done by a surgeon who has been properly trained and has a proper amount of experience, robotic surgery has better outcomes than non-robotic surgery. So robotic surgery is a complement to the surgeon. We are at this point not seeing fewer surgeons as a result of having the robots, but we do have better outcomes. So it's I would rather have the robot with a surgeon using a robot, and the surgeon is assuming the surgeon is properly trained on the robot. So complements. So we talked in the prior chapters about the hospital as a doctor's workshop. So I'm going to kind of bring that back up again, right? Most of this equipment is very expensive, and there's a reason why it is concentrated in hospitals. It's a central point, right, where the doctors come in. They don't own the equipment. So the radiologist doesn't own the MRI machine. The hospital owns the MRI machine, right? And the radiologist comes in and uses the MRI machine to do his or her work, right? Likewise, the surgeon doesn't own the robot. The hospital owns the robot. But the surgeon the surgeon comes in and use it, and multiple surgeons will come in and use the robot. So it's a shared resource between all the surgeons. So just want to keep bringing that idea up because I think it's a very useful idea for thinking about why do hospitals exist? Why are they important in our system? Nursing allows for, we have some equipment in nursing performs substitutions, and some is complement. So we'll come to those in a minute. But one of the important things to take away is that complementary technology effective complementary technology tends to raise the value and hence the wages of the person using the complementary technology. So I want to, for a simple example, what I talked about on Tuesday was, imagine you've got to dig a hole for a foundation, right? And you don't have a backhoe. So you've got to hire like 20 guys to come in with shovels and wheelbarrows, and they're, digging your foundation, and they're lifting the dirt out with buckets, and right, it takes them days and days to do it. Or you can hire one guy with a backhoe, right, who comes in and digs your foundation in maybe a day, right? Which the fact that the guy with the backhoe is able to do all that work by himself with his technology is a great example of a complementary technology. And people who are heavy equipment operators make a good living. Like they make a lot of money because they're able to create a lot of value by themselves. Whereas, so maybe you'd pay, $10,000 to have your foundation dug. Well, if you're if you're willing to pay $10,000, one guy could come in with his backhoe, dig the whole thing, and take the whole $10,000 for himself. Now he's got to pay for his backhoe, which is not trivial, but he's going to take the whole $10,000 for himself. Or you can split the $10,000 between 10 guys. And so on the one hand, the backhoe operator is making $10,000 from the job. On the other hand, the 10 guys with shovels are each making $1,000 on the job. So it's similar here in healthcare. If you can employ value creating technologies, your wages will be higher. And value creating technologies include working in a hospital. The hospital as a whole is itself a technology, right? It's an overarching technology where patients flow through and get all the different kinds of care that they need. So physicians that can then use the hospital as a technology can actually generate more value than a physician that doesn't have access to that. So let's talk about some specific examples of technology. So MRI is an example, right? So I keep talking about MRI because it's an amazing technology, right? It uses magnets, these giant magnets that go around you, and they produce this incredible view into the body without having to cut into it, right? So it's an incredible technology. Now, the importance of MRI and like why MRI versus say X-ray. Well, X-ray works really well on bones and dense hard tissues like bones and cartilage. It works pretty well, but it doesn't work as well or nearly as well on soft tissues like organs and organ systems, things like that, as well as muscle. So MRI provides a different tool and a lot of value, but it's expensive, right? Wentworth Douglas recently replaced their MRI. They have one MRI. They recently replaced their MRI. I want to say back in like 2018. And I was told that the total cost, because they had to do some construction to bring it in and install it, was to the tune of something like $2.4 million. So it's not cheap technology, right? But imagine if you're a physician and you're trying to do diagnosis and you have this, right? That's a pretty powerful tool and creates a lot of value for patients. I've been talking about surgical robots. So here's a surgical robot. This is a Da Vinci robot. So this is, as far as I know, one of the most common surgical robots. So what you've got here are all these tools that the surgeon is using. And note this, the surgeon is sitting over here, right? He's not next to the patient, and he's looking in through some binoculars, some virtual reality kind of binoculars. And then down here, you can see he's controlling the tools using little joysticks. I actually had a chance to kind of play around with one of these back when Exeter got their first Da Vinci. They had a demo that they had outside. I happened to go down to visit, and they had a demo Da Vinci robot outside their cafeteria. So I got to sit at this at the surgeon's site and play with the tools. And they had a little thing where you could use their tools to like pick up some rubber bands and move them around. But this is called laparoscopic surgery. So they're using so these are all laparoscopic tools that are going in and will go in and make small incisions and insert inside your body, right? And this allows for smaller incisions, more precision. So, if I'm an older surgeon and I'm getting a little bit shaky, the machine compensates for that, and and you get just so much higher precision. But to me, what's remarkable about this is to think about, like, and this is totally futuristic, like, not happening anytime soon. But if I can take the surgeon and move him over here 5 feet from the patient, then why can't I move him down the hall or even to a different building, right? Or even a different state, right? So what I can imagine at some point would be that we might have, so like, I talk about Androscoggin up in Berlin all the time, which is, up in the North Country, hard to recruit expensive surgeons, for example, to come up there. But what if you could put a Da Vinci robot in their OR, right? And you have maybe a surgical PA who's there to kind of, make sure everything is working well, and some nursing team. And the surgeon just logs into the Da Vinci robot from, let's say, Mass General, right? So maybe a 3-hour car ride away, does the surgery, right? Because again, he's not standing over the patient, he's over here, right? Does the surgery, from Mass General, finishes the surgery, tells the PA, okay, close up, finish off, and logs off, and then logs on to his next surgery, which is maybe not in Berlin, but in North Conway at Memorial Hospital, which is also a small critical access hospital, does another surgery where there's another surgical PA waiting. I think this is like, I just love thinking about possibilities, but this is an example of a complementary technology. It is an improvement in quality, right? In the sense that the recoveries are shorter, the outcomes tend to be better in the sense that you can do less damage to the patient with the robot. The robot allows more precision than a human hand can. So it's just, I feel like this is just such a cool thing. Aside from the fact that it's already there and it's already happening. Now, the downside of this is that Da Vinci robot is going to run you over $1 million, right? And the thing that I heard from Exeter when they first got it was, it's going to cost us $1 million for this robot, plus, I don't know, $250,000 a year in maintenance costs. But we're not getting compensated anymore for doing the exact same surgery. So there isn't like a extra reimbursement from Medicare if you use a Da Vinci robot as opposed to just do it freehand. And so the hospital has to eat that cost or find a way to be even more efficient, to do more surgeries so that it can make up for the fact that that robot's not free. So it's part of where the cost in healthcare comes from. Right. All right. So talking about complements for and substitutes for nursing. So this is kind of a blend. Hospital beds today are amazing things, right? Depending on the level of technology, these things can run upwards of $200,000. You think for a bed, $200,000. But this bed has sensors built into it that keep track of your blood pressure, keep track of your movements, keep track of your breathing, all kinds of stuff, all built into the bed, so that the nurses don't have to come over and do a blood pressure check on you, every couple of hours, because the bed is doing it continuously, which is an amazing compliment in the sense that, and an amazing contribution to quality outcomes, right? Because the bed is monitoring you constantly, unlike a nurse having to come and go out of the room to check on you. So if something starts to happen, you start to decompensate and start to, have trouble breathing, or your, blood pressure crashes, all that sort of stuff. The nurse, the bed calls the nurse and says, hey, there's a problem. So it's a kind of it's an amazing compliment, right? It adds to the ability of the nurse to do his or her job to take care of the patient. And so it's a complement, and it also reduces the labor required. So it's also both a complement and a potential substitute, in the sense that it reduces the amount of labor required to provide the same level of care. Again, super expensive, right? A couple $100,000 for one of these. And there are different levels, so they're not all that expensive, but like one you would put in an ICU, for example, where the patient is critically ill, is a very expensive piece of equipment. Now here's pretty much a pure substitute. This is a delivery robot. And these robots can be used for a whole slew of things, and they've been used for years. I remember when I first came into the Army back in 1992, and the hospital I was working in had a little robot like this that rolled around, didn't look quite like this, but it would roll around, and it basically would go. It had the ability to roll from the laboratory up to the wards to pick up lab tests that were being drawn by the nurses on the wards. The nurses would put it into the robot would do its rounds and then go deliver them to the laboratory. And so, what this does is it's a substitute for a low wage worker who, you'd have somebody pushing a tray around, picking up, pushing a cart around, picking up lab tests from, so I'm just checking my time, picking up lab tests from the wards and then bringing them back down. So we can eliminate the human component. We can substitute. I think I talked about this last time. A lot of economic progress is the substitution of capital, meaning machinery, for labor, meaning human beings. And so what it does is it frees up human beings to do other higher value added things. This robot never gets sick. It does break sometimes, but it never gets sick, doesn't get grumpy, right? Doesn't have a bad day, doesn't break up with its boyfriend or its girlfriend and call out, right? But it also doesn't have any human, interaction. It doesn't make patients feel good when they see it, so on. But it is highly reliable, right? And it can be used for delivering a whole range of things. Meals, right? You could imagine the kitchen prepping the meals and then putting them inside the robot and sending it up to the ward. I already talked about labs, medications, right? So the pharmacy, the inpatient pharmacy could be making up medications, put them in the little robot, and the robot could go up and deliver them. So this is an opportunity to substitute human labor for capital, for machinery, for tools. Now, I know some of you are LNAs, so you've probably used one of these patient lifts. I have never actually used one, but I think they're kind of cool, right? So here you have, and probably an LNA helping a elderly person make a transfer from her bed to the toilet and then back again. Now, obviously, this is a demo, but what's great about this is it reduces the amount of labor involved, right? So I believe you still have to use 2 people whenever you do a transfer, even with equipment, just for safety purposes. But it does allow you to reduce the number of people necessary to move. And this is a woman, the person the patient here that's being moved is a relatively small patient, but imagine you've got some, 300-pound bedridden patient. Getting that person to a toilet or to be able to get to bathe might require 3 or 4 people. And so things like technologies that are relatively simple. So like as opposed to an MRI or a robotic surgery or a surgery robot, this is pretty low tech, right? It's a hydraulic lift, maybe it's electric, but it really makes a big difference in terms of reducing human labor. And also, a lot of nurses get injured on the job lifting people. And so it reduces injuries to staff. So it's an important function, right? It's safer both for the patients and the staff. It can reduce the amount of staff necessary. So these are examples of technologies that we use as complements or substitutes, right? So both, in this case. So let's talk a little bit about some other kind of now into devices as opposed to just equipment. So again, I just never tire of seeing the miracles that are happening in healthcare as we apply the science, right, that we have developed over the last 200 years, 150 to 200 years, and seen just the, movement away from, tradition into science-based improvements. So here we've got an example. This was from 2 years ago, I think, where we had implanted uh, a device that allowed the man's own nervous system to communicate with his legs, and he was able to walk, with crutches, but he had a severed spine, right? So he should never have walked again. So these are things that are starting to happen, right? I mean, we've got a long way to go before this is common, but the possibilities are just amazing. And Elon Musk is working on, I forget if I've got a slide for this, but he's working on an implant that allows, I think he's like has allowed like a monkey to grab a banana using a mechanical arm just by using his brain. Like he's not actually working a joystick or anything. We got a long way to go, but like this is a thing that might happen in your lifetime where, we can do somebody who's paralyzed, we could potentially do an implant in their, in their brain, wire it in, and they might be able to walk, maybe not normal, but walk, right? As opposed to being limited to a wheelchair. So implantable devices are an important part. Now, this is kind of extreme, but much more common, right, are things like CRTs, right, which is used for if you've got a regular heartbeat, this will shock your heart back into a proper rhythm. People with diabetes, you can, you have to, if you have diabetes, you have to regularly prick yourself to see what, how much, where your blood sugar is. And now with insulin pump, and then you have to inject insulin. Now with insulin pumps, you can just wear this, and it automatically provides a continuous monitoring and dosage, right? So it's an improved quality of life, and these are implants. So some other medical devices, prosthetics. I'm going to ask you, this is a clip from the video that I'm going to ask you to watch, but just, prosthetics have come so far, even in my career. So since the 90s, the amount of research that was done as a result of the Gulf War I and Gulf War II into prosthetics has just been amazing. So this is speaking as an ex-military guy, the death rate, right, died of wounds, what we call it, died of wounds rate, meaning the people who were killed as a result of action, has fallen dramatically since the Vietnam War. And that's due in large part because everybody goes into battle wearing Kevlar armor and a Kevlar helmet. And so the survivability is much better because we protect the major organ systems. But a lot more people are now surviving injuries that would have killed them. So things like IED blasts, right? Bombs, homemade bombs. People survive it because they're wearing armor that protects their vital organs, but they might lose a limb as a result. So the ratio of people who are wounded and losing limbs has increased because those people in the past would have died. So they would have been killed in battle, died of wounds, but a combination of improvements in body armor, as well as improvements frankly, in medical care on the battlefield, have reduced the KIA rate, the died of wounds rate. But we've seen an increase in the number of people coming back with loss of limbs, for example. So better to lose a limb than die. But you want to have some, you want to restore quality of life for these folks. So I am asking you to watch this. This is one of my absolute favorite TED Talks. I love this video. And so Scott Summit talks about the work that he was doing at the time. I don't think he's not still involved in this particular thing. I actually wrote to him a couple of years ago telling him I'm such a huge fan of this video. And he wrote back and said he was working on some other kind of, it was a medical thing, but it wasn't this anymore. But this is just an inspiring video. So I hope you find it as interesting, but he does some really cool stuff with artificial limbs. And I won't steal too much thunder from that. Another device. So we had implantable, we had things, we've had tools that physicians and nurses use. We had implantable devices and prosthetics, right? And now another kind of device is consumer genetic testing. So 23andMe, probably many of you have done this, or ancestry.com or something like that. And, it's a swab. It's not invasive. You rub the inside of your cheek. That gets some cells on the swab, send it to 23andMe or one of the other ones. And they can do a whole slew of genetic testing to include, they can tell you, what percent of you are Irish and Italian and whatever else. But they can also tell you stuff like, what's your, do you have a genetic marker for early onset Alzheimer's? Do you have a genetic marker for Parkinson's? Do you have a genetic marker for blah, 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 right? There's a lot of stuff they can just tell you. And so when 23andMe initially launched, they were making that information available. You had to say you wanted it, and then they would tell you, hey, you've got a genetic marker for, metastatic breast cancer. Like, you're going to get we believe you'll get breast cancer and you'll likely die. So that's pretty bad news to get. And so this 23andMe was at a critical point of, should we regulate, and how should we regulate things like testing that is completely non-invasive, right? From a physical risk perspective, you literally can't hurt yourself with the swab. Like, unless I guess you would really have to poke yourself in the eye with it or something ridiculous, but you really can't hurt yourself with the swab. So the test itself has no possible physical harm. So the question is, should we regulate it as a medical device? Well, it provides diagnostic information to a patient. Now, if it said, if you got a report back from 23andMe that said you have a genetic marker for metastatic, breast cancer or colon cancer or something like that, or pancreatic cancer, it could mean that you have a slight, you might have twice the risk of getting one of these god awful cancers. But what if the risk of getting one of these cancers is 1 in a million? So now you have 2 in a million chance. Are you going to change your life as a result of that information? Well, if I tell you have double the chance of getting, Parkinson's disease, which is a slow and terrible way to die. If I tell you that you have double that chance, maybe you'd be like, wow, my life is terrible. I'm going to, everything is going to go bad for me. Right. But if you don't understand that twice the risk is really still like incredibly small possibility. And really, you know what? You shouldn't change your life at all. So the argument on the behalf of regulators is, or in favor of regulation and saying, treating that information as a medical device and saying 23andMe, you as a company cannot just give that to a consumer. You can't give them the fact that they're twice as likely to get Parkinson's. The only way that you could get that information, you as a consumer can get that information, is if you meet with a genetics counselor at the same time. So the argument there would be, and I actually had this argument with a former colleague of mine, because I'm on the side of the fence that says, you're an adult. You want to get the report? Fine. Like, you literally can't hurt yourself with the test. You should be able to have the test. And what you do with that information is up to you. If you're dumb enough to change your life because you now have a 2 in a million chance of getting a terrible disease as opposed to a 1 in a million chance, I'm not really sure that there's anything I can do for you. You're probably making bad decisions in the rest of your life, and this one is going to be is going to be trivial. But the argument that actually wins the day is we don't want people to get this information out of context without somebody to properly interpret it for you. I can see the value there, right? Like I'd freak out if the report came back saying you have double the chance. Of course, 23andMe could invest some intelligent design and not provide data that makes it scary, right? So the FDA has basically said 23andMe, you can't provide that information without some sort of medical advice attached to it. But this is where things get really blurry. Like for example, many of you probably have Apple Watches. I look around every now and then just to see who I see wearing one. But many of you probably have an Apple Watch. These things are now capable of doing EKGs, electrocardiograms, tracking your heart health continuously. I recently heard or read a study, I can't remember which. Basically, your iPhone, if you're wearing the sensors on an iWatch, are now sensitive enough that they can tell if you're having a heart attack before you even feel that you're having a heart attack. Like, it's a kind of incredible thing. So the question would be, is an iWatch, because it has that capability, a medical device? And if so, should people be able to have that information or not? And so these are questions that, as technology advances, one of the things is technology almost always stays ahead of, and technology innovation almost always stays ahead of regulators. Regulators almost always, trying to catch up with technology, which is way out here, right? And, as we get more things like, once there's like a little AI and artificial intelligence sitting inside your watch, I mean, it's going to get harder and harder to keep information from customers. And this technology is going to just get better and better. So, at some point, our regulatory regime is probably going to break and have to be thought about in a different way. So let's shift gears now away from equipment, both external and internal equipment, and talk a little bit about pharmaceuticals, because pharmaceuticals are just incredible too. Like, all this stuff is just like, wow. And so, we've all just lived through COVID-19, which was just groundbreaking research. Now, Moderna had been doing mRNA research for years, and it wasn't really, my understanding was, the research they were doing was not really oriented towards vaccines. It's more oriented towards cancer treatments. And I think I talked about this back at the beginning of the class. This is a technology that we have only just started to tap and to use, but vaccines really are just the start. But the fact that I don't know if you know this, but or I don't know if we've said this, but Moderna and they got the DNA from the Chinese government, like on a Friday, and by Monday they had the vaccine, right? The vaccine was ready. Like they were, because of the mRNA technology. It's just, rather than taking, like down here it says vaccines traditionally take 10 to 20 years to develop. The COVID-19 vaccine, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, were literally created over the weekend. And then the time from the point at which the vaccine was created to the time that it was deployed to the rest of us to use, and by the way, I'm on my 4th dose, so I'm a huge fan. all of that time, which was something like 6 to 8 months, all of it was regulatory review, was looking at and determining if it was safe and effective. Now, fair enough, we'd never used an mRNA vaccine before. This is it. This is the first one. We might all have those of us that took the mRNA vaccine may have medical problems down the line. Too soon to tell, right? Like we might all wind up getting some sort of bizarre cancer. Those of us that took it, I doubt it, but it's possible, right? And the only way we would know that is if we waited 20 years to see, if people took the vaccine. But what we did instead was we saved millions and millions of lives by using this vaccine quickly, maybe faster than we would normally use, but really just a remarkable evolution in healthcare. So, and I've also talked, I think, at one point or another, just because I find this so amazing, is when I was your age, HIV was just plaguing, young people throughout the world, right? And so it was really frightening, a frightening time. It affects certain populations more than others, but we were all scared of it. Really, it's just hard to kind of fathom, the experience of the late 80s, early 90s. And if you got HIV, it was going to kill you, right? Like it was just generally understood. If you got HIV, you were dead. And it was just really a matter of time, and time was pretty much short, at least initially. And then within a few years, they developed treatments, cocktails, meaning mixes of drugs that slowed the attack of HIV on the body. And now, like I said, I think I talked about one of the blogger podcasters that I really like, a guy named Andrew Sullivan, who was one of the leaders of marriage equality, had got HIV, I want to say in like 1990, and he's still alive, right? So 33 years later, he's been living with HIV. And he didn't think he would survive, but here he is, right? And still productive. But the problem is, it has been shifted from a death sentence, like I said here, to a chronic disease. Not only does the disease itself do harm to the body, but the treatments do harm to the body. These treatments are rough on the body, and so they all sorts of negative impacts on the body. Osteoporosis, I've heard, just a variety of things. So a doctor dealing with an HIV positive patient now can expect to have their patient survive, but they have to get a complex and expensive round of treatments continuously. Another example that I have talked about in class is hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is a dangerous disease. Similar to HIV, it is transmitted through blood transmission. So men who have sex with men and intravenous drug users that share needles are the most likely victims of, or are most likely to contract hepatitis C. So we see a high rate of hepatitis C in our homeless population because many of the homeless are also drug users. Not all, but a large portion of the homeless population are also drug users. And so we see that, and then we see a high prevalence of hepatitis C in the prison population. Now, it was back in, I want to say 2013, that the first treatments, Harvoni, came available that hepatitis C had been known for a while. We had been able to treat it and to minimize its impacts and control it, but it was a chronic disease. Once you had hepatitis C, you were going to have hepatitis C for the rest of your life, right? And so, like HIV, there was no cure. Well, back in around 2013, we came up with our first effective treatment for hepatitis C that would actually cure you, right? But the cost was $94,500. I'm not sure what it is today. I think it's still somewhere up there, right? And so now you're talking about people who are, mostly lower socioeconomic status. Many of them are in prison. Many of them are homeless. Are you going to spend $95,000 to cure them of hepatitis C, or are you going to give them medication that's relatively inexpensive? Let's say it costs $1,000 a year for hepatitis C medication, as opposed to curing them. Well, under a price-based rationing system, none of these people are going to get the Harvoni. They're not going to get the $95,000 cure, right? Because almost all of them are poor. Is that the right thing to do? Well, you have a couple of ways you can look at what does right mean, right? Well, one thing that right means is this is a contagious disease, right? If you don't cure them, they're going to go ahead and give it to somebody else, most likely, because they're not going to change their behaviors. So that's something to deal with. Another question about, what does right mean is this a just thing to do? Just because someone is poor, should we withhold life-altering treatment? So those are really tough questions that if you enter into a non-price, the price answer is no, they're not getting it, right? Unless somebody's going to buy it for them. And I'm not saying that's right? That's a tragedy. But under a non-price rationing system, it doesn't change the fact that it costs $95,000, right? If we're going to pay for all these folks to get the $95,000 treatment, that's going to take away from some other population getting healthcare too, right? So we're going to have to ration it, right? So somebody's going to, if we give that $95,000 in treatment to, say, a person who's in prison for murder, right? Who contracted it because he's using smuggled in heroin in the prison system, that $95,000 would have paid for, let's say, 20 women to have prenatal care and deliver healthier babies. So which one should we pay for? And that's where the benefit cost analysis comes in. If you're in a non-price rationing regime. And I don't have an answer. I want everybody to get treated, right? I want everybody to get cured of hepatitis C, and I want all the women to get prenatal care because none of it's a good outcome if whoever gets it. The problem is we don't have enough money to do everything for everybody. So, but this is a miracle. Like, you take an illness, hepatitis C, which would have stuck with you for the rest of your life, and we can literally cure you of it. All right. So why are pharmaceuticals so expensive? Why does it cost? Aside from the fact that you can assume the makers of Harvoni are capitalists and they're trying to make as much money as possible. How do we even come close to justifying a bill like that? Well, the reality is, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, that's JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that's the physician trade group, right? JAMA is one of the leading medical journals in the world. So they did a study and they looked at pharmaceutical companies launch all the time high risk, high chance, low probabilities of success studies trying to develop new drugs. So Harvoni is just one example, right, of a drug that this company, I forget, I think it's Gilead maybe, was trying to make. But they're also making like 50 other drugs. And the vast majority of those trials will fail. So they pump a bunch of money into trying to build all these drugs, and most of them never get past the lab, or they never get past the testing phase, and they never get approved by the FDA. And so the company just loses money outright on them. So the cost of bringing a new drug to market, something like Harvoni, right, is on average close to $1 billion. So think about that. It's going to cost you, on average, to get one, for every one success, you're going to have all these failures, but also there's a huge cost in navigating the FDA's system, the safety and their efficacy proofs that they require you to go through. On average, it's going to cost almost $1 billion. So in order for a pharmaceutical company to stay in business and generate profit for its shareholders, they're going to have to recoup that money, right? And then some. And now here's the other problem that we face. It's a patent. And so under US law, if you come up with, say, a new drug and you patent it, that means that nobody else can make it and sell it for the life of your patent. So you get 20 years from the time you patent something to sell it all day long at whatever price you want in the market, right? But at the end of 20 years, everybody can copy what you've been doing, right? They can just do whatever you've been doing. Now, here's the thing. Harvoni, I guarantee you, was patented years before it actually made it successfully through all its trials and got put on the market. So on average, I think it takes something like 7 or 8 years of the 20-year patent for a drug to actually get through the approval process. So that means that the clock is ticking. Like, it doesn't start when you bring the drug to market. It starts when you patent it. And so the patent is running out while you're still working on it. And so by the time they bring it to market, they've got 12 or 13 years to recoup that $1 billion. So if they have a relatively small market of people, they're going to have to charge a very high price in order to make that work, right? To make that profitable. So we don't have a better system than patent system. Trust me, there's lots of discussion about it. It's very interesting to think about, like, could we give awards? Could the government buy out the patent? All kinds of stuff. This is the best we've got. It's highly imperfect, but it's the best we've got for right now. Now, speaking of going off patent, when something goes off patent, it can be made into a generic. So if you, like, I never buy Motrin. I just go buy generic ibuprofen. Motrin is the brand name for ibuprofen. I don't need sexy ibuprofen, fancy Motrin ibuprofen. I'm just going to use generic ibuprofen. So there's a bunch of things about generics, but basically drugs that come off patent are then produced by generic producers. And you can get drugs a lot cheaper. This is one of the ways that we control healthcare prices, is by encouraging the creation of generic drugs. But so drugs can bring it down. Large generic, but here's an interesting twist. The largest generic manufacturers are actually overseas in China and India, where the FDA has a really tough time going in and inspecting their plants. So there are some really big generic manufacturers in New Jersey. The FDA has authority to do whatever it wants within the law. It has the ability to do whatever it needs to do in New Jersey, because that's the United States, right? But once we allow foreign countries to start producing, China and India, for example, they have huge generic drug industry, and they produce drugs that go all around the world. You may have taken some generic ibuprofen that was made in India. Catherine Eben, who's this TED Talk, looked into the pharmaceutical industry in India and found just how poorly regulated it was. The quality is really at risk. Like, if you're taking drugs that are made in a factory in India, it's a little scary. Very good book, Bottle of Lies, very good. Recommend it. Definitely eye-opening. Because so as we have a more global supply chain, we have the chance to reduce our costs, but we're taking more risk. And so very often, I'm a finance guy, so I very often look at, greater return, meaning lower prices, often comes with greater risks, right? The two things are often correlated. Are you prepared to take more risk with your loved ones? Are you prepared to give your baby generic ibuprofen that maybe was made in India, where the FDA is not able to inspect the factories, and they do produce some pretty nasty adulterated stuff sometimes. So something to think about as you go forward. You read that book, you'll definitely be thinking, maybe I will buy the sexy branded Motrin, right, and pay $10 a bottle instead of $2 a bottle. All right, last segment with the last 5 minutes I've got here. We're going to blow through information technology. Now, I'm going to give it short shrift. I'm going to not give it its due. But this is transforming medicine. Information technology is transforming medicine. You guys are probably hearing about ChatGPT and some of the advances in AI. We're doing some machine learning stuff here at UNH in my department where we can look at health data that's gathered in these electronic. So we've got these electronic health records now. Almost everybody's hooked into some sort of electronic health record. If you go to a Mass General Brigham System hospital, like a Wentworth Douglas, right? And you get seen by a doctor in their ED, and then you get referred to another doctor that's part of their system. Maybe you get referred down to Mass General because you've got, a heart condition or something. When you go down to Mass General, to the main Mass General, in Boston, your doctor pulls up your records, looks up, all right, where's Bonica, pulls it up, and he's got access, or she's got access, not only to whatever he did for you directly, but he's got access to all your records from the entire system that's part of the Mass General system. So whatever records you had back at Wentworth Douglas, he's got access to it. Same in the military health system. It's kind of amazing, right? Like I've had my healthcare at like 20 different hospitals in the military and clinics in the military, maybe more than that. And they're all on the same EHR. So wherever I show up in the military health system, they go bloop, 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 and there's Bonica, right? With, too high cholesterol, overweight, fat old dude, right? But they've got all my information. And so if something is, if I was to get brought into the ED at a military health system, they would have 20 years, 30 years of records on me. That's pretty amazing. But what's even more amazing is once they've got that information, not just about me, but about all of the people who are reliant on their system, they can start using machine learning to start digging through the records, looking for patterns in our behaviors and in our health status that they can actually predict. Oh man, he's had, Bonica's had these 3 things happen in the last 2 years. Let's get him in because he's on a pathway towards having some sort of serious heart disease issue. Let's get him in. Let's get him coached by a nutritionist, maybe one of you, and let's do some other testing to make sure he's not getting sick. And they can do that across, the whole system using this machine learning. So yeah, just skip through this. Predictive analytics, like I said, that's what I'm talking about. We need large population data. We can, start to find patterns and make predictions and identify, in particular, high risk patients so that we can get ahead of their disease and hopefully catch it before it happens. Something else that's absolutely fascinating is, again, with machine learning is, pattern recognition is what machine learning is especially good at. Radiology is going to be crushed by, in my opinion, crushed by AI. I think we're going to see a lot fewer radiologists. Those that stay are going to just basically be people that are working. They're going to work with AI reviews. So you're going to have, they'll get your MRI and then an AI is going to review it and tell the doctor, hey, I think this one's got a problem. Please look at it. So it's, anything that involves patterns, machines are better at it than humans are. we're also, you've probably at this point had telehealth, right? So communication, I've talked about this before, where like, for example, again, I love my Androscoggin Hospital, right? They partner with, we talked about this, tele ICU. So they've got a direct connection to Dartmouth Hitchcock, where they've got a teleneurologist who can basically, as a doc on a stick, can do some diagnostic work, tell if somebody's having a stroke or not, can help decide if the person should stay or not. But it's also being used for psychiatry, psychology, right? Many of these diagnostic treatments don't need to be done in person. Like, you're having a conversation. The doctor doesn't need to actually physically touch you in order to handle make some clinical decisions. So all of these things are making that cheaper. One of the things we saw during, while I was in the military, was we had a lot of psychiatrists stationed stateside doing consults with soldiers who were in Iran or Iraq, not Iran, but Iraq or Afghanistan, and taking care of them from Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. So making it cheaper than having to put a psychiatrist on a plane and send him off to war, right? So I talked about this, teleradiology, telepharmacy, all great stuff. So last slide, last minute. So we're also seeing this to improve business processes. So supply chain, making things cheaper, making the billing system work better, everything working better. So technology, it's pretty darn amazing. I just love thinking about the possibilities and the things that we're seeing, and the things that you will see in your lifetime that are just going to look like magic. All right, I will stop there. I'll hang on if anybody's got any questions or comments, but otherwise,